On the night of May the 31st, 1915, London was bombed from the air for the first time in its history. Floating thousands of feet above the capital came the Zeppelins like invaders from outer space. Zeppelins were vast, gas-filled airships, and the sight of them, as Doris Scott can recall, was uniquely terrifying for Londoners.
They look like cigars going along. They sort of move gracefully. They don't move quickly like an aeroplane. They sort of swan along. The thing that I got impressed on my mind, I was quite young, but I heard the people say, the neighbours, if the moon's out tonight, there'll be a raid. God, there'll be a raid. And I thought, the moon? What's the moon to do with it? They said, if she's out, it means Jerry can see his way over to England and bomb us, and there'll be a raid. And I thought, God, I used to pray every night that the moon wouldn't come out. And then finally they did come over, and we were told to be very, very careful because they were dropping poison sweets for children to pick up and eat. This is what we were told as kids. And not to, be very, very scared, because there was a kind of a shelter at the chapel at the corner, an underground cellar, where we could go if there was a raid.
Bomb shelters were makeshift, and air raid warnings primitive. The routine of life might suddenly be disrupted by the whistle of a bomb, as happened one night to Con Young's family.
My mother had a habit of always putting her clock right by the 10 o'clock train from Southend to London. It was a through train and it used to whistle. And this particular night, she picked the clock up and noticed it was 2 minutes to 10. And she thought it was a train whistle, but instead of that, it was the bomb coming through the air. The window came in on top of me. My little cat was on the bed. And during the blast, as soon as I opened my eyes, I saw him flying in the air straight through where the window had been. I was on the chair in the front room, and to my surprise, I could look straight out into the road. And just after that, the road was full of people. They were coming to see what had happened to us. And as we were right open to the road, they just stepped over the wall. They went all over the house, everywhere. And they left money in everything, any little place, any little ledge, or anywhere they put money.
In the raids by Zeppelins and later by aeroplanes, 670 Londoners died and 2,000 were injured. The toll of death and destruction had little impact on a city of 6 million people, and the Zeppelin was a military failure. But the novelty of the air attacks added powerfully to the sense that the dominant world position of Britain and its capital were being undermined. No longer was London secure on its island fortress. For the first time in centuries, it had suffered direct attack from an enemy. The capital's established way of life was totally disrupted. Wealthy young men went off cheerfully to France, many to die a miserable death in the trenches. Among the volunteers recruited in Trafalgar Square or herded in their hundreds through the streets of London were the butlers and footmen who had staffed the grand houses of the West End. And many of the maids joined the ranks of women who took over men's jobs in all walks of life. The great social upheaval of the 4 years of the war seemed to wipe out London's Victorian past. And when the war was over and peacetime life began again, the overriding impression was that the war had changed everything and was responsible for the new world which emerged. But the force which was to be most significant in the transformation of London in the 20s and 30s was an invasion not by German airships, but by an American culture and economy. And this invasion had begun before 1914. Nearly 10 years before the Zeppelins appeared, American ragtime music and dancing had swept fashionable London off its feet. The impact of ragtime in 1906 is recalled by Lady Charlotte Bonham Carter.
We all rushed to the dancing classes and learnt the ragtime because it was so utterly different from the very elegant waltz that we'd been dancing. The Americans were so lively and amusing, and they hadn't got our inhibitions. The Americans brought in their ragtime, which caught on at once. I think we suddenly realised that we were being rather old bores.
The Times newspaper complained that ragtime was the feverish music of the speculator. And it was, in fact, the product of an American society which had enjoyed an immense economic boom. Americans crossed the Atlantic on a tide of prosperity, attracted to London and to Britain as a new market for their products. Before 1914, much American industry was run by giant corporations using mass production techniques. This gave them a lead over small-scale British industry and led to an economic invasion from America, which was to have a great impact on London. It began with the Tobacco War of 1901. The head of the giant American Tobacco Company, James Buchanan, or Buck Duke, arrived in Liverpool and declared he would buy out the British tobacco industry. A fierce battle followed, with newspaper advertising by both sides, and 25 British firms amalgamated to form the Imperial Tobacco Company. The British and Americans then agreed to stay out of each other's territory and formed British American Tobacco to carve up markets in the rest of the world. And British American built themselves a big new office block on Millbank, opened in 1915.
Well, how about it? You've got to show the boat or a couple of watches on here, right? Fetch it over along the boat, will ya?
This same process by which British firms formed themselves into giant corporations to beat off foreign competition gathered pace in the interwar years. And the vogue for what was termed rationalisation of British industry led to a spate of office building in London, as Professor Leslie Hanna of the London School of Economics explains.
In both Germany and America, there was a greater tendency to go for industries like electrical engineering and chemicals, which required heavy investment in research and development. All these factors needed bigger organizations, and the competition was enough to make British industrialists ask questions about whether they should operate the same kind of organization, whether they should produce on a large scale. London gained tremendously from this change. When the large merger organizations were formed, they had to choose where to put their head office. They very rarely chose the provinces. It was almost always London. The proportion of firms before the First World War who had head offices in London was less than a quarter. By the 1930s, it was more than a half, as manufacturing firms, as well as the traditional city businesses, began to locate their headquarters here.
New office blocks arose to the west of the city, along the north bank of the Thames. A whole avenue of them was built in Kingsway, mostly in the 20s, with Bush House, designed by American architects for an American businessman, Irving T. Bush, as its centerpiece. These buildings, such as Shelmeck's House, looking like a giant mantelpiece clock, or Unilever House, are all monuments to the interwar boom in office building. All represent the invasion of London by a new economy. Imperial Chemical Industries, the classic example of interwar rationalisation of industry, built itself a new headquarters on Millbank, which was at the time the largest office block in Europe. Typically, ICI adopted an American style of organisation and management, which led to an increase in the number of office jobs in London, as Professor Leslie Hanna explains.
This building is a symbol of that vogue for rationalisation which swept British industry in the teeth of German and American competition between the wars. ICI very much modelled their strategy on DuPont's in America. They developed modern management accounting systems to coordinate their far-flung empire. They also increased the number of administrative and clerical workers and managers they needed to develop the coordinating power of this head office. There was quite a strong trend in the interwar years towards the development of a clerical staff and a managerial staff. Before the First World War, perhaps only 1 in 20 workers in British manufacturing were involved in office work rather than shop floor work. By the 1940s, it was already 1 in 5. These new head offices were a great fillip for clerical workers. The many commuters coming into the centre of London were vastly increased.
As the number of office workers rose between the wars, a new and more numerous middle class appeared, and London began to develop a kind of mass consumer society. This gave rise to a much larger market for the department stores of the West End. Regent Street, once the exclusive preserve of the aristocracy, was almost completely rebuilt in the 1920s in modernist style, and its stores catered for a wider section of the population. The department store was not new to London, but the design and style of those rebuilt between the wars often reflected the influence of Americans, who had developed an expertise in catering for the mass market and made their first impact on London with the arrival before 1914 of a man called Gordon H. Selfridge. Selfridge came from Chicago, where he had managed the Marshall Fields store. He bought a site at the rundown end of Oxford Street and set about building a department store to rival Harrods. Selfridge was interested in attracting all social classes to his store, and the opening in 1909 was preceded by a massive advertising campaign. He continued to promote Selfridge's with a series of publicity stunts, such as the display of the plane in which Blériot crossed the Channel. Between the wars, he extended his store, taking over a large area of Oxford Street and opening up a roof garden for all kinds of eye-catching events, such as a pogoing competition. Selfridge's style of department store influenced the running of established London stores as they were modernised and rebuilt between the wars. In Kensington, the firm of John Barker's, which owned Pontins and Derry and Toms, expanded rapidly, always with an eye on how Americans handled department stores for the mass consumer, as Andrew Saint of the GLC's Survey of London explains.
During the interwar period, John Barker's was so buoyant that it was able to rebuild no less than 3 stores in the High Street here. On the north side of the street, it rebuilt the Ladymere store, and then it was followed by Derry and Toms, on which I am standing, and Barker's straight across the street from me. All the time, the directors of Barker's were looking over their shoulders, as it were, at what was going on in the United States, and more particularly at Selfridge's here in Britain. The Americans were thought to be more efficient in organisational methods and in floor layout and in equipment and that kind of thing. So you find that the interior of Derry and Toms had very much an open floor plan, lifts banked together, concealed lighting, and that kind of a thing. A few years after they'd finished rebuilding the main part of Derry and Toms, they built this roof garden on the top, which was by far the most impressive and smart roof garden in any English department store.
Derry and Tom's Roof Garden, one of the great middle-class institutions of interwar London, was almost certainly based on an original American idea. It was part of a drive to attract a wider section of London's population to department stores and to provide shoppers with an exotic setting for their refreshment. The great expansion of Lyons' tea shops and corner houses between the wars also followed the opening up of the West End to a class of people who could afford cut-price luxury. Corner houses attracted people from all walks of life, as Dora Dyer, a Lyons waitress or nippy in the 20s, recalls.
When you were a nippy, you always got somebody that took a little bit of fancy to you sort of thing. And I had a very, very elite gentleman used to sit on my table. And one day when he went out, he left his card. And much to my amazement, he was the Consul General for Brazil. And I thought, oh, you know, very flattered that he could take this much notice of me. Anyway, the next time that he came in, asked me if I would go to dinner with him. You know, when you're young, you're a bit Anyway, I did go and he took me to the Savoy and I had a wonderful time. You know, first time I'd ever been in the Savoy. It was a lovely experience. There was a group of chaps came in. They were from a cricket club and I could tell by their conversation they took it in turns to take the girl home. And apparently it wasn't the chap that asked me. It wasn't his turn, but he insisted that he took me home and he was the gentleman that became my husband.
As the West End of London began to lose its old social exclusivity, aristocratic society, which had sustained the economy of this part of the capital in the 19th century, beat a slow retreat. American culture played a large part in transforming upper-crust society between the wars, and it had begun to make an impact before 1914, as Lady Charlotte Bonham Carter recalls.
The Americans had plenty of funds that they scattered about and gave under life for presents, and liked to have an English noble family as part of their list. The Americans were securely, as it were, part of London society by the beginning of the First World War. After the First World War, things were so utterly different. Life can't be compared at all.
After the war, the aristocracy did establish themselves again in the West End, but they were fighting a losing battle. Stanley Agar began work in this house in Belgrave Square, which is now the Mexican Embassy, in the 1920s.
We had about 18 staff, and my job really as stewardroom boy was to look after the upper crust of the servants, which consisted of the butler and the housekeeper, of course, the lady's maid, the valet, the under-butler, the groom in the chambers, and the chef. Really, the people who were struggling to keep going were the really old people, like Lord and Lady Coventry were really Victorians. I mean, they were nearly 90. And the Smiths were well over 60 at that time. And these were the people, they were still struggling to get back onto an even footing. But even by this time, the footmen had been drastically cut down. The groom of the chambers was on the way out. A lot of valets were on the way out or never came back. And certainly stewardroom boy and these sort of people, they were all out. And the hall boy became pantry boy. So he really became an inferior footman right from the day he started.
In the 1920s, the grander houses of Mayfair began to come tumbling down. On Park Lane, the Duke of Westminster's mansion, Grosvenor House, was demolished to make way for the Grosvenor House Hotel.
The grand house was no longer a working possibility. There were several wonderful houses. After the war, they all began to disappear into commercial establishments.
The Duke of Westminster sold Grosvenor House to become a hotel, and the gentry of the day, that's the old ones, they weren't a bit happy about this. And it really was the start of the breaking up of Park Lane, because very soon after that, Sir George Holford died, and the Dorchester was then sold by Lord Morley again to become another hotel. The leading families in Park Lane were very upset about this altogether, particularly the Londonderrys at the bottom, and the Duke of Wellington just round the corner at Apsley House. So it wasn't a favourable move at all. And now when I come down Park Lane, I don't recognise a single house that I used to know quite well in the old days.
It was said that Park Lane was looking more and more like Fifth Avenue in New York. And in fact, the interior of Grosvenor House was designed specifically with American tourists in mind. These were the first hotel rooms in London with ensuite bathroom, and a must for all Americans, iced drinking water on tap.
The only way to keep these people happy with their ice water was either to chip some of this ice and cool it for them that way, or to put a bowl or a jug of water in our old-fashioned ice box until they asked for it. That's all we could do. I mean, the fridges came in our big houses, not till about 1930, I wouldn't say.
Along with their liking for iced water, the Americans brought in the fashion for cocktails.
We didn't know anything about mixing cocktails and things. As a first footman, I was sent round the Savoy to see one of the barmen round there. He taught me a few basics that I found very useful in my later life.
So many things that Americans brought in with them were so suitable and sensible to modern life. They understood about modern life very.
American visitors became more and more important to the West End economy. They brought in new wealth as the fortunes of the aristocracy declined.
The American tourists came over, they poured in, they used us, I think, as a jumping off ground, to do very interesting tours. Then they married English males or married English females. The ones who married English females went off to America, and the males who married Americans, of course, the Americans stayed here. And they were very jolly indeed. They lightened society delightfully.
By the 1930s, the invasion of the Old West End by an American culture of jazz and nightclubs was almost complete. The life of aristocratic young ladies, or debutantes, was very different from that of an earlier generation. Lady Marguerite Strickland was a bright young thing of the 30s.
Florida was the first nightclub that was popular with the Debs, and that was great fun. The men wore cloaks and there were telephones on all the tables, and you could be rung up by a man across the room. It was very romantic. When I got married, I went to 2 or 3 nightclubs every night. The 400, of course, was the most popular of all. Everybody loved that. It was pitch dark. But there was Monseigneur, Embassy, Ciro's, a Slip-In, Paradise, a Gargoyle, a Kit Kat, a Nest, a 43. There were lots and lots of them. After 3 or 4 nightclubs, in one's evening dress, we used to drive down at 3 or 4 o'clock in the dark, down to Eton at Windsor, and go to the bank at Cuckoo Weir, slip the dress off, and the shoes, I suppose, and swim. I always swam whenever I possibly could. In all my heavy silver jewellery, I remember swimming there. And then, of course, it started to get light, and you had to clamber out with nothing on. It was great fun.
Though wealthy Americans had themselves introduced a new way of life to the West End, by the 1930s, the cinema, dominated by Hollywood films, was the most powerful promoter of the American way of life. Film stars set fashions, and their arrival at film premieres began to eclipse the social occasions of the aristocracy, which had once been the great crowd-pulling events in London.
The London season is getting underway, a fact that's important to the debutante, if not to you. So here's the exclusive picture of the exclusive debutantes' ball at Grosvenor House.
By the 1930s, debutantes were themselves being treated almost like film stars. The annual Debs Ball, a spectacular invented in the 20s to raise funds for Queen Charlotte's Hospital and held in the new Grosvenor House Hotel, looked like a Hollywood film set. And the debutantes themselves were being recruited in the 30s by American advertising agencies, such as J. Walter Thompson, to sell the products of the emerging consumer society. Among the aristocratic beauties who recommended Pond's cold cream was Lady Marguerite Strickland.
I was Deb age, living on a farm in Surrey, and due to a very bitter divorce, I wasn't allowed to see my father at all. And Pons must have written to me and offered me £50, and I was very excited because I had no money at all. And I accepted, and I suppose they must have put a picture in the paper, because straight away a telegram came from my father, give the money back and cancel the whole thing. He was furious with me, but of course I refused.
The recruitment of aristocratic ladies to promote Pond's cold cream or Kirby grips was the ultimate fusion of the old and new, which created a prosperous Americanized London between the wars.
Once there was a huge 30, 40-foot picture of me in Piccadilly Circus, lit with spotlights from the other side. It was a Horlicks advertisement, and it had written on it, only written on it, do you suffer from night starvation? And Jimmy Horlick, my father, were going past it in a taxi, and Jimmy Horlick, not really knowing, who it was, said, did you see our advertisement up there? And my father said, yes, that's my daughter.
The invasion of London by an alien culture and economy had transformed it and given the old heart of the empire a new and prosperous lease of life. Between the wars, London remained a wealthy international capital, its new vitality symbolised by the nightly neon display in Piccadilly Circus.
An illustrated book of the series, The Making of Modern London 1914 to 1939 by Gavin Waitman and Steve Humphreys, published by Sidgwick and Jackson, is available from booksellers, price £10.95.